Hello, everyone. What is reconciliation? What does Indigenous mean? What's the truth of Canada? What can I do? These are common questions that I'm frequently asked. And so my hopes for today is just merely to provide a bit of insight and contribute to the dialogues that are occurring throughout the country. A few years ago, I was visiting up home where I'm from, up north in James Bay, a community called Moosonee, which is in northern Ontario. And I was spending time with my family, and I was visiting with my grandparents. And I was sharing about my experiences of living, working in Toronto. And my grandparents glanced at me and they asked, "Michael, kinesisotina?" Kinesisotina. For them, that was a language-based question. In the Mushkego Cree language, it means, "Do you understand me?" And that really resonated with regards to my role at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. One of my key functions is to provide educational awareness sessions to organizations in both the public and private sector. And in that regard, the aims are to bridge pathways between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I live and work in Toronto, which is an urban area, and my roots are from a remote community. And I see this as one of the fundamental challenges for this country, is that when we make reference to Indigenous, it gets relegated to being exclusively an Indigenous narrative. So I'd urge each and every one of you here to expand your scope of thinking to see it not as an Indigenous narrative, but from a national perspective, and also not excluding from an urban versus remote. And so for each and every one of you here, this is just merely a process. It's not an outcome. I am unable to speak on the affairs of Indigenous nations, nor do I represent individual or collective groups. I am just merely a community member with a message to share and contributing within the conversation. So my idea for today is regards to self-awareness. And in my grandparents' sentiment, the key word is understanding. What is my understanding to reconciliation, and does it mean anything to you? So what is reconciliation? It's a question that requires context and has garnered much prominence following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission producing a final report with 94 calls to action. A call to action for all Canadians. And one of the key elements has been with regards to education. If I asked each and every one of you here today how you would define reconciliation, I may receive a wide variance of interpretation. And from my experience, there are two pathways I see for reconciliation, from a retributive or restorative basis. My efforts are aligned restorative narratives because it's not adversarial nature, it promotes dialogue, it's an exchange of views, and it promotes healing. So for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, my question to you, where do you stand? From retribution or restoration? So within regards to that, the spaces that are being created between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, if we're promoting dialogue, exchanging views, there's another key question for your own self-reflection. Canada has defined its relationship to occur between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but what does Indigenous mean? For example, for individual and collective whom are First Nation, Métis, Inuit in Canada, you may associate with the following terms: Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, Indian, status, non-status, on reserve, off reserve, urban Indigenous, etc. Who defined those terms? I'm going to draw a line in the sand. That there is rooted in bureaucracy and policy. If I introduce myself to you, I would say, "Whatche, Michael Etherington Skasun, Umushkego Nina," not Indigenous Nina, not Aboriginal Nina. But this is important. There's no right or wrong response to this. If you associate with as such, justifiably so. But it's important to acknowledge etymology, the roots of this language, and the origin of these terms. Because in Canada, we currently have over 60 active Indigenous languages in this country. So if we stand for reconciliation, how many official languages should there be? Not 2, over 60. And so in that regard here, the views that are being shaped between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous, I want to focus for the non-Indigenous. When these dialogues are occurring, this space that is being defined is crucially important. As a non-Indigenous Canadian, do you see this conversation from a position of respect and recognition? Or do you see Indigenous people from a position of disadvantage? There are systemic realities in this country, but does that define who Indigenous people are? We've been so extensively labeled and classified as victims, marginalized, oppressed, displaced, dispossessed. So in that manner, I share with you, everyone here, we must understand an objective truth to understand this conversation, because that's where the accountability lies. So for each and every one of you here, and for all Canadians, where do you see this? From a position of respect and recognition? Or do you see it from a position of disadvantage? To understand that, we must understand the truth. Truth and reconciliation. What is the truth? 2017 is a significant year. It's been identified as Canada's 150. I would echo the sentiments of many Indigenous community members and leaders throughout the country who have said decolonize 150, resist 150, Canada's 150 plus, saying that Canada is merely more than 150 years. I remain neutral in this conversation. It's not my role to define, but I saw this year as a unique opportunity to provide education and awareness to community. So for Canada's 150, I ask simply, where are we now? There are 2 contradiction conversations within this country. One is of assimilation policy. The other is through the treaty relationship, nation to nation, and the inherent rights to land. One of these 2 garners more recognition than the other, which is assimilation policy. And if we look at this objectively, this here must be challenged. And this conversation must be shared in the same light to move forward, to reduce the misinformation, to reduce the misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. I'd like to explain this first when I say reference to assimilation policy. Assimilation policy in Canada is referenced through the Indian Act, the reserve system, residential schools, 60 Scoop, and also the contemporary context of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the child welfare and justice system. I categorize this as the systematic breakdown of the collective, the family, and in the individual. The collective being the Indian Act and reserves, the family being residential schools and the 60 Scoop, and the individual for the child welfare and justice system. But this here is euphemistic in nature. If you do not have a context or understanding of the history, you will relegate this to a confirmation bias and disassociate yourself from the facts. So to veer away from the euphemism, I will define these as such in my own view. The Indian Act is racialized policy against a population of people that is active legislation in 2017. The reserve system is an apartheid system. Residential schools, I categorize as genocide in Canada, not cultural genocide. And then also, the 60 Scoop is the stolen generation of Indigenous children. I would like to focus my point with regards to residential schools and provide my rationale. I've been providing hundreds of presentations to public and private sector, and I've asked groups, cultural genocide, in association with residential schools, many interpret it as solely as an impact on one's cultural values and a loss of identity, and does not establish the objective truth of that institution. For example, in 1907, Dr. Peter Bryce produced a report to Head of Indian Affairs, which identified the mortality rates in that school. One had a mortality rate as high as 75%, and the common trend throughout the schools that were reviewed was 24%. In 1948, the United Nations held the Genocide Convention following World War II. The countries came together to establish an understanding of what constitutes and is defined as genocide, which was found and called Article 2. Article 2 had 5 clauses, and Canada fails that in association to residential schools. But I would like to emphasize Article 3. In there was a term called cultural genocide. And through a request for information, there is a memorandum out there that identifies Canada being in complete opposition to having that term recognized. And it says, if this term is not dropped, do not become a signatory to this convention. And as a result, that term was dropped. In Canada, we fall under the British common law system. There's a legal term. It's called precedent. Precedent decides future decision making. My question is this. In relation to residential schools, why is Canada implementing terminology they were historically in opposition to? This is one of many unanswered questions with regards to reconciliation and also how to move our efforts forward in a just way. Now, the second narrative has to do with the treaty relationship, inherent rights to land, nation to nation. I see this as the platform for reconciliation in Canada. Because when you make reference to reconciliation, we're not creating a new process. It's through restoration. Because there are historical instances that speak to the validity of these relations through peace, friendship, respect, and trust. Now, the assimilation policies have impacted that trust and hindered the pathways we seek as Indigenous and non-Indigenous. For each and every one of you here, I would encourage you to familiarize yourself, well, where does my relationship lie in terms of the land I reside on? Your point of reference could be ceded and unceded lands. Now, these acts of reconciliation, I would like to provide a critique with regards to land acknowledgements, because these are some of the early precursors to reconciliation moving forward. When I provide reference to land acknowledgements, I would like to also highlight the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Within there, there's a clause. It's called FPIC, Free Prior Informed Consent. When I speak in public forums, I get a wide array of organizational representatives from public and private sector, and I ask everyone this: how many here are implementing land acknowledgements? I don't know why, but everyone smiles and goes, yeah. They're expecting, I don't know, some type of pat on the back. But then I ask them this: how many of you that have your hand up, how many of you communicated, consulted with, and established consent from all those Indigenous nations that you just identified? All the hands go down. To that I ask, is that not a subtle continuation of paternalism, assuming it's in the best interest for these nations to be identified? And if reconciliation is about relationships, doesn't that speak to an absence of a relationship being present? Because that is rooted in rhetoric. I'm not against land acknowledgements. I am just challenged by their implementation. But there's another second factor to this as well. The public and private sector have a different statement than as a political and crown representative. It's called title to land. So if a crown representative acknowledges the various Indigenous nations, they're opening up a broader conversation for land claims. So this is my question to you. Are these sentiments, these acts of reconciliation, are they done in a meaningful way? Are they mutually beneficial? And are they in the spirit of reconciliation? So I'd encourage everyone here to build those relations. And those relationships lie at a local and regional engagement. To tie all this together, for my point, I'd like to speak from the oral histories. I made it evidently clear to not use slides, because oral histories and many community members share as such an exchange of stories, being an orator. Because as Indigenous and non-Indigenous, what we share is community and also the land. So this is a story of the land. It's called Wisegajak. How many of you been to Thunder Bay? Raise your hand. A few of you here. Do you know the sleeping giant? They say that's how, I can see you laughing, my friend. They say that's how large Wisegajak is, was this giant being who traveled. And Wisegajak was traveling, and there was no humans on the land at this time, just animals and birds. And Wisegajak goes to his community and says, today I've decided to give my power to you, the community. And Wisegajak brought out this pot of color. One by one, all the animals and birds began to line up, and he started dipping them into this pot of color. And as they wandered, they started developing gifts. I always make reference in contemporary. How many of you get a new suit jacket and you feel good? It was the same manner as such. These animals and birds started developing their gifts, and they said they developed this, which was the voice. Over and over, these animals and birds. And so, for example, one of these birds got into their voice and made a call. And then flew off. And they say this pot of color became less and less and less until there's no more. And then Wisegajak says, I have given my power to you, the community. And now these animals and birds celebrated. And so from that, they say the woodpecker was the one that was missing. And the woodpecker became absent. And then after Wisegajak returned, all these animals and birds were frantic and said, Wisegajak, Wisegajak, you forgot the woodpecker. And then Wisegajak said, what can I do? And the animals and birds said, what if we work together? And that's what was done. This woodpecker was dipped in, brought together, and out came this drop of red. And they say this bird was the happiest bird of them all. Now to close off a story for the people, I spoke to a school at one time, and this young child came up to me, who was in grade 3, and said, Michael, when are our parents and teachers going to catch up to us? And so in that, what I would say, for us as Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to answer a question, the time is now for us to stand together, to walk together, and to heal together. One day at a time, one step at a time. Here's my call to action to you. What side of history do you want to be a part of for the next 150 years? With that being said, thank you, and miigwech.